Well, good day and thanks for joining us. My name is Jessica DeVita. I'm with Azure DevOps. I'm joined today by colleagues from Pushpay, Fastly, and Adaptive Capacity Labs for a really incredible discussion on postmortems that was so exciting that we had to split it into two parts. So on the call with me is Duck Lawn, Tom Griffin, Sue Allspaw Pomeroy, John Allspaw, and Dr. Richard Cook. Thanks again for tuning in. Here's part one.
The topic of postmortems and learning from incidents and accidents, and bringing the good news of that work to the world as best we're able. So with that, thanks everybody for joining. So if you don't mind, Duck, would you start us out? And I'll give some context here. So just a few weeks ago, I was in New Zealand at DevOps Days in Wellington, had an open space session that I joined and proposed where we were sort of talking about this topic. And I was thrilled to get to know Duck. And Duck, they have been at Pushpay, and they have been, it turns out, learning from the Etsy guide on post facilitation debriefing guide. And so I was very excited to hear about what's happening at Pushpay around postmortems. And so with that, I will just again we'll go around and do some introductions. So Duck, take it away.
Yeah. Hi everyone. So I'm Duck Lawn, and I'm a SRE at Pushpay. So at Pushpay we build software to process payments and build apps for organizations like churches and not-for-profits, which means if we have an outage, there's a literal dollar value on how much money we can't process during that time. So outages are really important to us, and postmortems are really important to us. And we've always been following a sort of postmortem process at Pushpay, but we noticed around a year ago that it wasn't working out for us. And we started as a company moving towards trying out a bunch of different things to get more out of them, and we found the Etsy facilitated postmortem guide through some of John's tweets about it. And my colleague who's on the call here has been pushing it through it at Pushpay and helping us get better at it. So I'll hand over to you, Tom.
Great.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you. My name's Tom Griffin, and I'm an engineering manager at Pushpay. And I've been involved in postmortems here for about a year or so, although as an engineering team, we've been doing them since the engineering team was really, really small. And recently we realized, triggered actually by one of John's tweets about a year ago, that we weren't getting as much value out of our process as we used to. We sort of realized this, and Josh Robb, our SVP of engineering and product, reflected the thinking back to us as a team and said, we've got an issue here to work through. He said he didn't know the answer. He gave it to us in the team to figure out, which was great because people like me who are a little bit new to this area, and Duck as well, we could start to find our own solution to some of the issues we were having. Yeah, and then eventually, as Duck said, we found our way to facilitated postmortems, and it's great.
Fantastic. Well, I'll also pick on Sue and introduce Sue, who I've recently gotten to know better, and I'm excited to hear about your experiences with postmortem work, and especially around how that impacts with information, security, InfoSec, So I'll stop and say hi to Sue.
Sure. Hi, I'm Sue Allspaw Pomeroy. I work for Fastly. We provide an edge cloud platform. About 10% of the internet flows through our systems on a daily basis. So availability is very important to us as well. I've formerly worked at SendGrid for the past 4 years, where I helped grow and spearhead the postmortem process, sort of in a very grassroots way, to just help us get better at learning, right? Just that's the bottom line, right? Learning.
Very cool. And John, I think folks know you, but please give us
My name is John Allspaw. I until about 2 years ago, I guess now, I was CTO at a company in Brooklyn called Etsy, and I think we made some progress on taking, I would say, a sort of a different perspective on a different route, some different directions on learning from incidents. Most of that direction was mostly informed by what I had read and learned from the application of these sort of approaches. I wouldn't say methods, but from other domains. And Richard Cook, who's also on the call, was a strong influence and in that. And since I left Etsy, I've been doing consulting along with Richard and Dr. David Woods in a company that we call Adaptive Capacity Labs, focused on this very topic. And I think what we're finding is that it is quite difficult. This topic we're talking about. It takes a lot of effort to do well. When you do it well, it does turn out to be a competitive advantage. And so what we've been trying to do is introduce these, again, quite different perspectives. Software is not used to taking these the stance that we're sort of advocating for, and hopefully we'll make some progress on that front. That's a intro from me.
Thank you. Thanks, John. And Dr. Richard Cook.
Hi, my name is Richard Cook. I carry John's bags for him when we travel together, and make sure that the accommodations are adequate for him. No, but John and I have known each other for a very long time. We've been exploring these areas, trying to understand more about what the obstacles to learning from incidents are. Actually, we know many of those. We're more interested in how people overcome some of those obstacles, or how they end run those obstacles to get some value out of these experiences. And so we're constantly listening to people talk about what it's like to try and do this, and what the kinds of problems and also satisfactions are that come from the experience. And that's really one of the things we were hoping to hear from our friends in New Zealand today, is more about what they had to do to accomplish this, and also what the benefits or the satisfactions are from having done this.
You took the words out of my mouth. Yeah, I was so excited too to introduce everyone, because you're just all connected in this way that you had no idea, and it's just neat. And so with that, I will come back to Pushpay and Tom and Duck. Tell us about what you're able to share, and let's chat about it. I'm excited to hear you share some of the stories that I've gotten a preview of.
Okay, Duck, should we sort of start at the start of this year?
Yeah, I reckon.
Yeah.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we'd had a post-mortem process at Pushpay ever since the engineering team was really small, and we always looked across at Etsy for inspiration, and got a lot of inspiration back 3 or 4 years ago. Our initial process was, we call them blameless post-mortems. And we had, soon after an incident was resolved, we'd start up a post-mortem document. We'd establish a little bit of an executive summary, and then do the timeline of what happened. And then we sort of had a discussion section in an asynchronous sort of collaborative way in a wiki page. And then ultimately we'd identify some mitigations. And that worked really well for us for a long time, especially the collaborative nature on the wiki. We were always really conscious of, if we got together in a post-incident review meeting, loud voices can dominate quieter voices, where we felt we were more successful if you could put everyone can put their comments in on the wiki page at their own leisure and their own time, and you get many more perspectives out of it. So that was working really well. And looking back, what probably happened is we started to optimize the process. And one aspect of the process was reporting up to board level in a summarized form. Here's how our postmortems are going, severity, trends, that kind of thing. And as an engineering team, we may have sort of optimized the process a little too much. And the artifact became too much about, our postmortem process became a little too much about the artifact.
Yeah, it was all about the fact that there was an incident rather than what we could learn from it. I also think sort of as during that time, the company grew really quickly. We've had this massive growth curve over the last 4 years. And I think the implicit knowledge of why we do postmortems, like that we learn from them, was sort of lost along the way. I don't think we onboarded quite as well as we could have with the purpose of the document. It was like, oh yeah, I do this thing, and then the board knows that we had an incident and we fixed it. Not, you know, I do this thing and I learn about what went wrong and I fix the process.
Postmortem learning, as a new employee, learning about postmortem, sort of in the early days, you get a one-to-one, spend time one-to-one with someone who was already experienced with it. And that worked until we reached a certain size, and then beyond that, that just didn't scale. And that's where we lost some of the context and reasoning why we do these.
I don't think we ended up with, I don't know, a lot of people talk about how they ended up with all these metrics at the end and they didn't actually do anything about it. And I don't think that was what happened to us. We ended up with a lot of alerts. So things that we could action. So we became a lot better at finding problems and fixing problems. But I don't think we became better at avoiding problems.
Our mitigation's still strong, but we were not always getting those deeper learnings.
And not sharing any of those sort of implicit knowledges that some people had with other members of the team. That wasn't happening at all. It was just like, oh, now we all know what happened, rather than now we all know how to work out what happened. So our SVP worked it out, so because he was seeing it all go up to the board and presenting it to the board, and was seeing that the quality was just not there anymore. And he took us to an all hands and went, we got to fix this. Don't know how, but this is what I'm seeing.
He said he can't do it. It's all our problem, which was nice. Left space for us to fill in. He did actually mention that Etsy does facilitated postmortems, and they had a sort of a 2-3 day certification training course, something like that. And at the time, I was sitting there going, no, that's not going to work for us. My initial perspectives were that going back to a meeting would reintroduce the problem of loud voices dominating. That was my first response. And then secondly, I thought a 2-day certification, I mean, you know, whether that was true or not, a 2-day certification effort also wouldn't be particularly feasible down here in the team. So I thought, no, that's not going to be the path for us back in February. So what we did next is, I sort of feel like I was acting, if you've read the Lean Startup, in there's a concept of an intrapreneur. So you sort of have this idea and you try a bunch of things to try and get something going within a company. And so we started doing that. We started a Slack channel, of course, to get attention and ideas collected all in one space, and also refer to some articles by you, John, and other such things to get people inspired.
That's where I really jumped on the process. I was so excited to see the benefit come in. I'd felt a little disillusioned by the postmortem process, so I was really keen to fix it, and that's sort of when I jumped into it.
The problems that sort of emerged were the learnings weren't being shared beyond the incident team. We were wondering if people were feeling pressure to complete the postmortem and then get back to feature work. We were wondering about that. And the other problem we were addressing is just how to onboard people effectively into the process and make them understand why and the benefits, and not so they didn't just think it was something they had to get done.
Sue, does that, I just want to check in too with Sue, does that, I know you had gone through some similar kind of, your paths of course were different, but I'm just curious, Sue, if that mirrors any experiences that you had.
Yeah, absolutely. So much of this rings true where, people are at one point got really excited to be in the postmortem room. And we typically almost always had a facilitated postmortem. But finding people to facilitate was difficult because people were either afraid they were going to do it wrong, afraid they were going to make somebody get all blamey. I think was the term. I don't want to get blamey, so I'm really afraid that I'm going to ask the wrong questions. Getting that learning out of the room was the hardest thing, and we, I think, tried and maybe didn't quite succeed all the time, or at all, at bringing that knowledge out. Asking folks to talk to their teams about it. It was very inconsistent. Some teams would bring that knowledge back and talk about it in their Scrum retros, but most wouldn't because they're just on to the next thing, or seeing if we could share that knowledge at an all hands meeting or an engineering all hands, just to get it out there to all the teams. And it was always the least important thing on the agenda, right? So it always got dropped in the interest of time. So I feel like that is probably one of the largest hurdles to me. If that's this, it sounds like it's the same for Pushpay. Is that really that next mountain? The first mountain was getting folks to actually figure out that it's learning and not action items, right? First it was don't blame people. Then it was it's not about the action items, and now it's how do you share, right?
Thanks, Sue, because I was, I was like, oh, you had gone through some of this too. And I want to come back to Tom and Duck for 1 second, because you did something interesting around how you were kind of working on building up your bench of facilitators, as I recall. And so I wanted to just pop back and ask you about that before I forget.
Yeah. When we did move to facilitated postmortems, we very quickly found out that we had probably one person who was really good at them. He's now one of the directors of engineering, Alex Henderson. He was super great at digging into the right places and getting all the information out of people. And then we had a really bad month for postmortems. We had so many.
Double the amount, I'd say.
Yeah, double the normal amount, and he just didn't have time. And this was right just before his promotion to director as well, so he was really busy. And we just didn't do any facilitated postmortems for the whole month, and that was horrible. We didn't want that to happen. So Tom started asking around, more people want to get involved, who wants to start up, and I jumped in, and so did Tom, and we started learning. So we were reading the guide, and we ran a couple of postmortems ourselves, and we recorded them so we could share that with other people. We allowed people to dial into the Hangout and just observe, but we wouldn't let them contribute because we wanted to keep it really focused on the team who was there. What else did we try, Tom?
Well, we also pretty quickly realized that for us, a facilitated postmortem needs two people. One, obviously the facilitator, and they're focus is on preparation and then concentrating on facilitating during the actual meeting. We identified that that facilitator needs a support person who we call an organizer. And the organizer does everything else. They set up the meeting, they organize the recording, which is sometimes hard to remember, as I found out. They take notes, take all the notes in the session, and we follow the Etsy Guide's suggestion of seeking feedback on the 2 success criteria after each one. Have you learned something that'll change the way you work, and would you come to one of these again? We send out that feedback after each one we do, along with any other questions we want to know. So what we recommend is if anyone's interested in getting involved, they do what Duck described, and then the first step is to be an organizer. Then you're in the room and you can see all what goes on. And then if you're feeling good about that, you can have a crack at facilitating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we also did debriefs as well. So afterwards, the facilitator would write about what they had felt during the process, you know, do a self-reflection on things that they didn't think they did well and things that they do think they did well. Yeah. And the organizer would do the same. We had some organizers who were not engineers and they struggled to keep up with the jargon. So that was really interesting. I found that like I really asked leading questions in the first couple. I was like, I know the answer, and I would lead them to it, and that was terrible. Didn't work out so well. But I thought it was really interesting getting everyone to sort of self-reflect and share that back with everyone else who was wanting to become a facilitator. It showed that, you know, none of us who were doing it were perfect. Yeah. We were all making mistakes as we did it, and that was fine. Just identify and grow while you're helping grow other people. It's such a constant learning process, and I think that fear of being too blameful or asking the wrong question is definitely there. I'm always afraid that I'm going to make someone feel worse at the end of it, but I've found that I've almost made them feel better, so that's good. But you have to do it first.
If I could make a couple of reflections here. This is great. First of all, this is great to hear. Duck and Tom, like hearing about that at Pushpay is really helpful. I've got all kinds of questions for you, actually. Sue's question earlier, which was, you know, is that sort of, you know, one of the hurdles, maybe a first hurdle would be to be sort of aware of the dynamic or the phenomena of blame, the social constructs and sort of contracts about participation and that sort of thing. And I think what you said is maybe the next hurdle is to, you know, is to sort of
was it action items, John?
Was it action items?
Yeah, it was like
yeah, I mean
first and then action items. Did I get that right? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean, first of all of these things, I would argue that. So I think the answer is yes to all of those. I'm not entirely sure that what you're pointing out as these being sort of hurdles or milestones like this. I don't know if it's uniformly distributed. You know, I don't know if it's the industry as a whole, and I think that some organizations are much further along. You know, on that first topic you mentioned there is, and sort of this is what I think I put this in a talk I gave about a year ago, which was that sort of the blameless part. First of all, it's a difficult term. From vocabulary, it's quite difficult, and in the Stellar report, which is this document that this group, the Snafu Catchers, of which I'm happily a part of. Around 12 minutes past the hour, and so Paul Reed wrote a blog post and said maybe a patch that he would submit is really blame aware, or being aware of blame as a dynamic. In the end, it's just a thing to be aware of that is a necessary condition. What I'd said in this talk was that it's sort of table stakes. The whole point of that is to set up the conditions for people to give descriptions of their experience in a way that was that is as unfiltered, or not unfiltered, but sort of uninfluenced. The fact of the matter is that that influence will always be there, full stop. There's no such thing as a blameless environment. You can't actually say that that's true. And I'd go further to say that you could be an absolute poster organization, the absolute epitome of blamelessness, and learn very little. And largely because that's a condition, right? One of the conditions to play golf is have a golf course, right? That does not make me a golfer, or any shape or form. I think the thing that you mentioned, Sue, which is again like changing the stance, or not the stance, really the aim about learning from the formation of action items. I think you're absolutely right, but I think it requires a lot more explanation. By the way, this explanation doesn't fit in 280 characters. So the idea that the first, and this is something that Richard's written and has become clear to us, is that you can't actually prevent learning. Learning is happening. It's not about the learning. It's not about you're learning or you're not learning. You're always learning. In fact, you're learning from the time that you're born. The question isn't whether you're learning. The question is, what are you learning? And sometimes you're learning that these postmortems are just a terrible waste of time. Sometimes you're learning that the most important thing to organizations are these sort of shallow sort of metrics. You need to make your time to resolve graph go down, and that's what you'll do. You want incidents to have lower time to resolve. Guess what? You're going to get them. And you could do that by a number of things. Of course, the biggest lever is make the definition of an incident malleable. And that way you have a pretty good shot at making that go down. And so in the end, if you think about, you had mentioned earlier something at Pushpay where there was a concern that that folks were kind of like maybe phoning it in, saying like, oh, typing some stuff in the doc, so they get back to feature work. Well, I want to pull. I'll stop talking in a second here. I built up some thoughts while you guys were talking. What goes into, think about that for a second. What goes into feature work? Well, that sort of binary of looking backwards at an incident, we can either do that or can move forward to do feature work. That sort of binary comparison's been made before. Another binary comparison is infrastructure versus product. Another binary is, well, if you're of the old school or ITIL, there's non-functional requirements, and then there's feature work, right? DevOps. But where does that feature work come from? So you think, oh, well, feature work comes from writing stuff for new features, okay? Sometimes those require new architectures, right? Or the always the ever-present migration from legacy, right? So everyone's always migrating from legacy. So let's say that just migrating from legacy or new architectures or writing new code for new features. So imagine that. So they're no longer, we can't spend time thinking about the past and all of that stuff we got to plow forward. So, but if you poke at that a little bit, where does that come from? How do engineers do feature work? When they create or design or put together plans for legacy migrations or new architectures, thought exercises, can you tell them to, we need you to migrate this or do this new architecture, do this thing, greenfield. But by the way, we need you to do it. We need you to completely ignore any conversations you've ever had in a postmortem meeting. Right? You can't take into account any incidents you've ever experienced in the past. Right? Well, people would look at you like, do you even know what software engineering is? A big part of feature work, of any normal work, is fueled with anticipation, right? I want to write this feature, I want to write this code so that it doesn't break, so that it does the thing I want, and that it can handle this variation of behavior that we don't want. We don't want it to be brittle. We don't want it to like fall over the first time somebody, goes to the web page with some esoteric, opera on Atari or something like that, right? So I think what we find is that the dialogue and the process of sort of, walking through, oh, this thing works this way. I didn't know that. Or I thought it worked only this way. I thought it could only break this way, but it turns out it could do this thing and that sort of thing. This informs, even if there's no action item, right? The action item isn't Steve, Lisa, remember this. That's not a Jira ticket, right? But you can't tell them not to remember it. They do remember it, and it influences their feature work. Those things are much more sort of connected. What I will sort of end on, and you know what, Duck, you mentioned a couple of really great things, and I feel like they need even more highlighting. What you said on the topic of facilitation is that you found somebody who got really good at this, who was really good at this, and you described a little. I want to ask so many more questions described about how to get more people, yourself included, good at this. One, kudos for acknowledging that this is a thing that you can get good at, actually, and it's an iterative practice process. It's not a deterministic, prescriptive thing. But what you said was you could the person at the time who was the director of engineering or said he could get information out of people, right? That is I'm paraphrasing. That is really a big deal, and the process of bringing the process one of focusing, like, look, even the best organizations have a finite amount of time and attention that they can spend on these things. The question isn't whether how long you do them. The question is how well can you make use of the time that you have. So focusing on things that have the potential to really matter is a skill. Getting really supporting people who have expertise. What we like to say is that's a funny thing about expertise. Experts are not necessarily expert at describing about what makes them an expert, right? And quite often what we see in practice is some of the most productive, really insightful, and I mean group debriefings are when engineers say something that everybody says, wait, what did you say? Oh yeah, the Framostat does this, X, Y, and Z. And wait, what? What do you mean? Yeah, I thought everybody knew that. No, they didn't. And so why would they get that? And so support people in saying those things out loud that they don't think they need to say, to draw the diagrams they don't think they need to draw, and they don't think they need to draw them or say them because they think everybody else already knows it, is huge. And in the end, this idea, that this is valuable time. The way I like to sum it up is that, like Tom, what you mentioned, we put in the guide, which is if there's a greater chance for people to come to the next one, right? I can tell you, I can shortcut this. The more often you hear this, and I'll tell you what it is in a minute, the more often you hear this, the more often people will continue to come, and more of them will come, and more of them will schedule their debriefings and postmortem meetings around the people who can set up these conditions. Okay, and this is what it is. You listen for this, it's a very positive signal, right? So you're in a postmortem meeting. When you hear this, oh, right. What? Oh, I did not know. What is the? I did not know that. That's when you know things are going well. And that is really, and getting good at that, getting good at setting up those, you'll guarantee people show up. I'll stop talking.
Absolutely. Can I say two quick follow-up comments and well, maybe it's a question. I have a question for Richard, and I have a comment for Doug and Tom. So two things. So for Doug and Tom, Doug, I remember you telling me, I'm pretty sure you told me this, but it was something like you had asked a person, how are you feeling? And I think Doug and Sue have both kind of like checked in with people at kind of like that level. How is that like for you? And they've never been asked that before. And then separately, relatedly, Richard, if you could speak to this too, one of the things you first kind of shared with me was, what's the temperature in the room? Like, what does it feel like in there? And, I just think there's so much probably to explore there. So I'm just going to stop with that. So yeah, so Doug, you had mentioned, kind of the way you checked in at some point with someone. I think Sue, you've done the same. And yeah, like I mentioned, Richard, kind of, what's the temperature like? So Richard.
Yeah, I'm in Chicago. The temperature's always cold. Yeah, I think we, and I'll say something that may sound a little bit a little off, perhaps, but you'll forgive me because I think it's true. This world, like many other worlds where there's a large amount of technical information and high levels of technical expertise, very often imagines that we can somehow disconnect the real human consequences of what is happening in incidents from the technical meaning, and we like to have this kind of almost a sterilized or almost inanimate description of events because we think that somehow that's better, it's more accurate, it's more scientific. But in fact, these are scary events in many cases, and the terror that goes along with being in the middle of an incident that you don't know how it's going to end can be very, very great. And I think being able to acknowledge that and being able to let people know that is part of the experience is very helpful. I think being able to manage the tensions that exist around the kinds of issues that get brought up is very important. We in the technical world have a way of encoding human conflicts in technical terms. So it's not uncommon for us to regard a strong emotional outburst or some problem behavior as something that's really hard to deal with, and we will build some technical stuff, or we'll describe that in a technical way, or we'll try to distance ourselves from that. And I think that's probably unwise. This stuff that you're doing is actually really important, and it's not just beneficial in the sort of dollars and cents way. It's important on a variety of different levels, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that and that we direct some attention to it. I do want to say my background is from medicine, and we do this in medicine with what the conferences we call morbidity and mortality meetings, sometimes called quality improvement meetings, but they're really morbidity and mortality, or M&M. And like the technical world, these things can be done well or very poorly. They can be productive or very unproductive. They can be generative and helpful, or they can be really destructive. And I think that some care and attention to these things is really needed. I think that that's going to become more the case in the future. As the systems that you're dealing with become more important, as they have greater reach, as people depend upon them more, as they have greater impact, as the value of the function of the system goes up, then the consequences of events will increase. And as the consequences increase, it becomes harder and harder to maintain this pleasant, positive environment that you're trying to construct. And practice at doing this is really important, because if you're practicing on the events that have relatively low consequences or minor consequences, you'll be much better when it gets to be a big consequence. And I'm telling you, those events will happen. And the test of this in some ways is whether or not, when those big events happen, the process remains. That it continues to function in that way, that we continue to do that. That's the real testing for us, that we've really integrated this into our world. And I think the development of the skill and expertise that you've described is very encouraging and crucially important. The world is going to continue to behave badly and in surprising ways, and being able to respond to those things in productive and generative ways is crucially important for the health of the organization, for the health of the people who are involved in it, and likely for the health of the society that depends upon these things. And I'm very encouraged when I hear that people are exploring and doing this stuff. I think it's the kind of thing that really needs to happen. And I'm so impressed with it, and I'm very encouraged. And so you'll appreciate it then when I say, in the words of Game of Thrones, winter is coming. The one thing I can be sure of is that you're going to face very challenging events that have large consequences, where people are hurt by them, where your company is hurt by them, where you yourself may be hurt by them. And practicing it now in these kinds of settings, when that hasn't yet happened, or it happens only rarely, is crucially important to being able to do it when it's really difficult. The military people have a saying, they say, fight like you train and train like you fight. And I think that's really applies here. You have to become very skilled at this. And you yourself, Duck and Tom, have made palpable for us the kind of development of expertise at doing this, how that develops with practice, and how you become better. And I think that's crucial. It's absolutely crucial. At one point, I think you said something that anyone can do this. I'm not sure I agree. I think to actually do this requires a kind of selflessness, a kind of ability to restrain one's own ego and one's own need for comfort, and being able to be in an uncomfortable place. Many of the qualities that make a good facilitator are found in the very best therapists. But it also means that the facilitator has to be able to keep track of prepare for and keep track of the technical content of what's going on, understand what the issues actually are, be able to raise them at appropriate times, be able to sense when the conversation is flagging or when it's gone in an unproductive direction and redirect it. I mean, these are important and quite difficult to learn skills. And I'm just really excited about and in a way very humbled by the description of what it is that you're doing, because it's clear that you've got it. Whatever it is, whatever that thing is, and we're not really sure, but whatever it is, you've got it.
Yeah,
Jessica?
it's like this magic, it's like, can we bottle that? What is it? And I think, John, in your redeploy talk, you touched on this notion. It's like, can you point to resilience? It's like, what are you pointing to? What, and that, for me, this notion that, I love that resilience is above the line. For those that have read the Stella report, we spend a lot of time on systems. We have entire conferences dedicated to these things, entire, hundreds of Slack channels dedicated to, all the different kinds of tooling and things like that. And never to me, well, not never, but, the notion that the work is happening in your head before it happens anywhere else. And, that impacts which keys you press. And, the system, these are what, if I'm understanding it correctly, this is the joint cognitive system. It's not just you, it's not just the tools. It is in fact the interaction and that distributed cognition of, like, the machine is sort of like, what does the machine think I am? I won't get into, because I don't even understand them myself yet. But anyways, so those are just, some things that are coming up for me.
There's a great book called Human Machine Reconfigurations that you should definitely check out, and we'll link to it in the show notes. So with that, we're going to take a break and hope you'll come back to hear part 2 of the conversation, where we'll take some questions that came in from the community. Thanks again for listening. Take care.